Pray for us, and especially for peace in the Holy Land. Amen. So, iconography and Catholics. Iconography and the Catholic Church. Iconography and Catholic liturgy. Do the two really go together? Or is a Catholic doing icons a bit like a cuckoo in the nest? Something strange and exotic and disturbing and even possibly destructive to the integrity of the icon? That's perhaps a good question to start with. And the discussion that I was having with Matthew really was sort of touching on this subject, because I think a lot of us who are Catholics and involved in the world of Byzantine iconography often are left feeling quite emasculated, second best, sort of at best welcome friends at the table of the banquet of orthodoxy. At worst, heretics who should be nowhere near the place. Well, let's forget that a bit, because I think most of my experience with Orthodox is that there is a genuine love and delight, really, that non-Orthodox people have a love for icons. And secondly, I think in a way that exposes the problem that as Catholics we've sort of handed over the legitimacy of iconography to the Orthodox. So this really is their art, and we're just sort of interlopers. So that's something I think is worth challenging. It's such a vast topic, it is difficult to know quite where to break open, which is why I was really hoping for some of your questions. But there haven't really been any, so in fact there's been no questions whatsoever. So to make use of this time and opportunity, I'm just going to sort of begin to explore some ideas a little further. And if you have any questions now, if you want to make any feedback now, please put them in the comments, and then I can see them, and then I'll try to respond to them. So I'm really in your hands to answer whatever questions you might have, YouTube as well as Facebook. So this is good. So one of the things which, as a Catholic, I've been sort of more and more aware of is that when you read people like Uspensky and Florensky and Conticlew and all the sort of great names in iconography, they tend to just pass over the contribution of Catholics. And a good example will be Aidan, who's a good friend of mine, Aidan Hart, just written a really nice little book, which I have here somewhere, which is a sort of introduction to iconography. And in the book, he talks about the struggle about iconoclasm, and the popes get hardly a mention. But the opponents of iconoclasm within the Church's hierarchy really came from the Catholic Church. And essentially, the popes, who were vigorous in their defense of icons, vigorous in opposing the emperor, even to the point of facing death threats and the possibility of exile. But they didn't give in. They remained resilient. They witnessed to the Orthodox faith. And the Byzantine Empire completely gave way to the heresy of iconoclasm. It wasn't just a heresy. It was schism, because it separated the Byzantine Church from the rest of the Church. And it was also sacrilege, because the Byzantine Empire went into a whole-scale suppression of images. It exiled the makers of icons who turned up in the West and had quite an impact in Rome and in the court of the Carolingians. And the Byzantine Empire not only did that, but it also desecrated the image of Christ. You know, when you destroy an icon deliberately, when you deface the image of Our Lady and the saints on the walls of a church, it's called desecration, sacrilege. This is really serious, and I think when you read the accounts of iconoclasm, largely from within the Byzantine world, either historians of Byzantium or Orthodox Christians, their perspective naturally sort of dominates the narrative that they tell. And over the last century, the contribution of the non-Orthodox, the non-Byzantines, has sort of been allowed to just sort of fade from sight, combined with a sort of robust reassertion of Orthodox identity in the last 50 years, you know, with the return of, or the fall of communism, return of the church to a place of prominence in Russia and across the former Soviet Warsaw Pact lands. So this sort of really strong response to a renewed Orthodox identity hasn't wanted to see anything other than Orthodoxy achieving anything. It's very much a sealed-in view. Whereas if you come from the Catholic world, a lot of this just doesn't feel quite right. And over the last sort of couple of years, I've begun to really dig into what really happened during iconoclasm. And St. Theodore the Studite, for example, who is one of the very few people who oppose iconoclasm from within Byzantium, and most of the opposition, in fact almost all the opposition, came from monks and monasteries, not from bishops, not from the hierarchy. They were largely subservient to the will of the emperor. They were apparatchiks of the imperial bureaucracy. So the resistance came not from the Byzantine church, but from the monks, people like St. Theodore of the Studion monastery. And he makes it very clear that when it comes to orthodoxy, the office of Peter, the office of the papacy, is the bastion of the Orthodox faith. So, you know, even these acknowledged theologians of the icon, greatly revered by the Orthodox, you find even from their lips this affirmation of just how important the papacy is. So I think when you begin to sort of peel away the sort of Orthodox veneer, looking back at what happened, and take a sort of fresh view, and really sort of weigh up just what was going on, how serious it was. You know, this wasn't a temporary blip. You know, some odd emperor had a bit of a fit about images. This lasted on and off for the best part of 100 years, 150 years. It was basically endorsed by the entire hierarchy of the Byzantine Church. We have no records of any substantial opposition, apart from, as I say, from within the monasteries. That means that when we look for the restoration of images in the Byzantine world, we have to really understand that iconography had to be reinvented. It wasn't just a sort of something that went wrong, you know, for a few years, or decade. This was something that was deeply, deeply entrenched in Byzantine culture, and so then had to be Okay, so let's see if I can let. I've got somebody come into the Zoom meeting, and I've got there we are, Carol. Hello. Are you hearing me? Oh. Oh well, there we are. Now just a bit of a strange person giving a very nasty video up there. So never mind. So, so back to what I was saying, that the peel back that sort of orthodox perspective, take a fresh view, and really start weighing up the seriousness of what iconoclasm means or meant at the time, and then reassess the contributions of Catholicism, especially the popes, to that whole period. Because, you know, we're not talking, as I say, about 10 or 20 years, we're talking about 1.5 centuries. What held the Orthodox faith in place? Where did it go? Where was it found? It was found in Rome and the West. And the centre of creativity in liturgical art during this period shifted to Rome and also to the Carolingian court. So that's a little bit north into Germany and France. Charlemagne's domain. Now, people will make a big thing, very big thing, among some Orthodox commentators about how the Charlemagne eventually rejects iconography and the use of image in a profound liminal sense, but they don't make the same effort to really understand how the whole of the West had just simply continued the practice of the universal church. And the problem with Charlemagne is very brief, and also it only penetrates a very limited part of the Western Church. It's again a problem with an emperor, or the Byzantine Empire as a whole, to whom the patriarchs and the bishops were completely subservient, continued their heresy for 150 years with the desecration of images, whereas in the West, even with Charlemagne, he still allowed images, even though it was with a reduced understanding. This was never accepted by the popes. It was never part of the teaching of the Western Church, only of a particular part of it. And while there might be an argument to say that it shapes certain attitudes in the West towards how images should be used, I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that the tradition about the use of images in the church, in the West, was never broken. It didn't need to be restored like it did in the East. It didn't need to be reinvented. In the West, it just continued. So the commentary of Charlemagne and one of his bishops and so on, these local council that he held, never had the seriousness that the heresy of the Byzantine emperors did. And the impact on the West, I think, is something that deserves re-evaluation from Orthodox sources, to actually acknowledge that the West continues the tradition unabated for the entire period. So the continuity, you know, the Orthodox will tell us, we've never changed everything, it's the way it's always been. No, when it comes to iconoclasm, for 150 years you did change it. And the Orthodox only continued the practice of the universal church as it had been preserved in Rome and developed in Rome and in the Western Church, not least in the court of Charlemagne, where the liturgical arts go through a great renaissance. So all of that, I think, for me means we, as Catholics, have a very positive inheritance. And that means two things. One, I think we can sit at the table of Byzantine iconography with confidence. It's just as much our art as anybody's, because our community, our church, has never rejected the image. And secondly, I think it gives us a broader perspective, and that we can understand iconography as being something that doesn't just have to be a Byzantine form. That the Byzantine form of the icon is a local church, a local culture. The Catholic Church, as the word implies, is universal. And so within the Western context, within the Catholic context, I think we can begin to have a little bit more self-confidence and reclaim a breadth of style and indeed a breadth of use. So I think one of the problems with Byzantine iconography is that while it is an absolute genius when it comes to liminal image, how do you make an image that speaks of heaven, that actually is an image that you can venerate with confidence? Well, look at the Byzantines. They have done it with sheer genius, and it's developed over many years of prayer and so forth. However, at the same time, the Western Church has stained glass. I mean, if you want a liminal image of light, you get your light from the sunlight pouring through colour, and it is sublime. It creates an ambience. Now, I think one of the purposes of liturgical art is to mark the space. So the liminality isn't so much for the veneration of an individual saint, but to really mark off the liminal space, the space of the altar, the place of the temple. It's a consecrated space, and that's expressed in terms of the way it's decorated, not just simply because it's got an icon of the Pantocrator in it, or a statue of the Virgin Mary. The actual space itself is consecrated by a bishop, the altar likewise, and anointed with oil. The art of the space, whether it's the decorative art, or if it's didactic art, actually it's spelling out what the space is for. This goes back into the catacombs, into the very early church, and you think about the catacombs where the Christians meet to pray for the martyrs who have died and are buried there. This is a burial chamber, and the art, for example, of Jonah and the whale, symbols of the resurrection, biblical story about the resurrection. By painting that on the walls, it actually says, this is what is really going on in this space if you look deeper. So you can see that the very earliest examples of a consecrated space, the catacombs, it's clear. You look at Jura Europos and the fragments of remains from the baptistry, for example, and the imagery that is there. Again, evoking some of the great biblical themes, like the liberation of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt, freedom from slavery, freedom from sin, crossing the Red Sea, and then parting the waters, and this being a foreshadowing of baptism. So the way in which that space is decorated is resonating not with images to be venerated, but images that resonate with what that space is for. So we can see, I think, three different types of imagery, liturgical imagery. One which is purely decorative, a second which is really illustrating or marking or consecrating the space with the themes from Scripture and the faith and giving them a visual form, articulation. And then the peak are the images for veneration, which are sort of on a parallel, certainly in canon law in the Western Church, with the veneration of saints in their relics. So you venerate the saints in their relics and you venerate them in their images. And those images are really what we call icons. So that's all good. So I think the Western Church kept that breadth of styles of liturgical art and didn't get bogged down into one particular form. So we kept statues, for example. As I mentioned, we developed stained glass. We had a much more vibrant, dynamic interaction with the whole space. And you think of the Gothic cathedral and the sheer genius of creating this space of light, breaking the walls open with these vast walls of glass. You think of like going into Milan Cathedral, the Duomo, and the great, it's almost like a forest of soaring trees. You're walking through paradise, and the stone breaking out into foliage in the carvings and decoration. All of this is the rich inheritance of liturgical art of the West, and the East doesn't manage that. It goes deep into one particular style of liturgical art and restricted to one form, the flat image. So it's a panel icon, it's a fresco on the wall, it's a mosaic on the wall, a flat embroidery. But they really remain constricted by that. And some apologists from within Orthodoxy like to suggest that somehow that's a purer form and this sort of stuff. But most sort of just pass it over. And I think partly because actually there's no reason whatsoever why an image shouldn't be three-dimensional. It occupies a space and consecrates a space, and we live in space, not on these flat surfaces. And when you think about, say, the tympanum over the archway in some of these Romanesque churches in France, for example, they're glorious, but they're not sort of deceptively naturalistic. They really are a living space of transfigured imagery. And I think when you get sort of three-dimensional imagery, when you get relief carvings and so forth, these add a richness to the world of liturgical art. Anyway, one of you with me. I think, given that, I will now draw things to a close, unless there is a question. It'd be lovely to have a question, but nevertheless, I think if there isn't, then I will bring this to a halt. Well, thanks to those of you who did come and watch, and I'll rethink the format, because I really would love to feel that this is making is of some value, and that it's creating a little bit of movement in the way in which we as a community think, especially Catholics, and I'd be disappointed if we can't find a way to do that. So if you would like to make a comment about that, I'd be grateful. Or email me, or send me a message on Messenger on Facebook, and I'd be grateful for any feedback. Meanwhile, wish you all a very good evening, happy Sunday, and hope you have a great week ahead. and God bless you. Bye for now.